Okay, welcome everyone to our Cradle-to-Career Governing Board meeting. Today is August 10th, and we welcome all of our board members, all of our advisory board members that have joined, and then of course our public colleagues as well that are online right now too. So we'll go ahead and get started with a welcome and just a meeting overview from our incoming board chair, Robert Tagorda. So Robert, you can go ahead and kick us off.
Good morning. I'd like to welcome the Cradle-to-Career governing board members, the C2C office team, and members of the public to today's C2C governing board meeting. My name is Robert Tagorda, the new incoming board chair. I will be in this role until July 2023, after which I will transition to board chair. Amy Fong, our presiding chair, is unable to attend today's meeting, so I'm facilitating our proceedings in her place. And while we're on the topic of governing board members, I'd like to take a moment to extend my heartfelt congratulations to Lande Ajose and Gavin Payne. This past June, Governor Newsom reappointed Lande and Gavin to continue serving on our board, and we welcome them continuously as part of our team. So for today's agenda, first we'll hear several updates regarding the C2C office and work plan from our Executive Director, Mary Ann Bates. Then we'll shift to the C2C draft budget change concept. Then we'll hear report outs from our Executive Director Review Process Ad Hoc Committee, our Teacher Data Task Force, and our Employment Data Task Force. Lastly, we'll end with an overview of the legislative report. So we'll start with the team and zoom out from there. So now some logistics before I turn it over to Mary Ann, just a couple of them. In today's meeting, we're inviting public comment at multiple points throughout the meeting. Typically, an agenda item will be presented, we will discuss it, then we invite public comment. If it's an item for a vote, I will then invite a motion and take a vote. So with that, let me turn it over now to Mary Ann.
Thank you so much, Robert. Really appreciate that. It's great to see all of you. Hello to all the board members and hello to the public. We're really glad that you're here and being a part of this meeting today with us. So I'm going to start with a couple of updates of some highlights that have occurred in the last quarter since we met in May. And before we go over to the rest of the agenda. So first up, we have some updates on hiring and our team. Before we go into the new hires, I just wanted to reflect, next slide, please, on the team that we've had for most of the last 6 months. So this is our small but mighty Cradle-to-Career team. You all know Sydney Armendariz, who's our Chief of Strategic Initiatives and Partnerships and leads and spearheads our work with you as a governing board and with our advisory boards. Zishan Chady, our admin chief. Dan Lamery, who's our data architect. Ron Marriott, General Counsel and Chief Privacy Officer, and Danielle Reynoso, our office technician. So this is the team as we have had it for most of the past 6 months. And as you'll recall, at the last board meeting, we announced 4 positions that we were posting and had just posted. And many thanks to all of you on the board for sharing those positions widely with your networks and encouraging people to apply. We had a lot of interest in the positions, received a very high number of applications, and I'm happy to report that we have made hires for all 4 of those positions, which you can see here on this slide. And since we're on Zoom, I thought it would be nice for them to say hello. So we'll start with Sebastian. If you can unmute and say hello and introduce yourself.
Thanks, Mary Ann, and good morning, board members and others that have joined the meeting. My name is Sebastian Chobard, joining the C2C team as an Associate Governmental Program Analyst, but that's sort of my state title, and I'm also, my role is Contract and Procurement Analyst, and really going to help streamline the contract process so we can move things forward. Here at C2C. I'm coming from the advocacy world, so hello to any advocates that are on the call. I was previously with the California Edge Coalition, and really the work there really made me realize the potential of C2C and all the great work that's doing. And like Mary Ann said, they announced they were hiring, and I thought it'd be a great opportunity. So I do have an earlier start date. I have started already before, some of the rest of my colleagues on here. And I'm really, glad to have some of that training and certificates out of the way, so it really can get started when the rest of the team joins. So hello again, and board members. I've actually had the pleasure to meet some of you already, but hoping to meet all of you very soon. And please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or anything for me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sebastian. Next, we have Ryan Estriado, who's our new Director of Data Programs.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Just wanted to say hi this morning and let you know how excited I am to be joining up with the team. I'm transitioning out of my role at the San Diego County Office of Education, where I work for a project called Equity, Disproportionality, and Design, where we build services to reduce inequality in special education. My whole career has been in public ed. Before that, I was a district office administrator, and then before that, a school psychologist. And I can't tell you how much I'm excited to be joining up, and wanted to thank everybody for the opportunity. Can't wait to work with y'all.
Great. Thanks so much, Ryan. As you can see on the slide, Ryan is going to be joining us in a couple of weeks. Dan Lamory has been on our team, as I mentioned, as a special consultant and our data architect. He's on vacation today, and we take vacation seriously at Cradle-to-Career, so he won't be dialing in. So I'll just mention in his place, we're really excited that Dan will now be permanently joining our team as the Director of Data Infrastructure. He has experience integrating major data systems across California's education system, had worked as a lead architect on the CalPass Plus data system, and also was the lead data architect and engineer for the multiple measures assessment project. So we're really thrilled to have him now as a permanent member of the team. He officially started his role as Director of Data Infrastructure last week as well. So that's Dan, whom some of you have already met. Next up, I'd like to welcome Shannon to introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Shannon Serrato, and I'll be the new Director of Engagement with Cradle-to-Career. And I'm just so excited to join you all virtually today. Prior to C2C, I was with the Institute for College Access and Success, or TICAS, for nearly 15 years. And I've done everything communications director and below. So I am very, very excited. I know the power of data and communications for good, and I am just really thrilled to be thinking about the ways that we can be building out systems that will truly work for students in the state of California. This is really something that I'm passionate about, and I'm just so excited to be joining the team very, very soon. So thank you all again for letting me join today.
Thank you, Shannon. So thank you to the three of you for introducing yourselves. I'm really excited about the team as we're expanding it. And with these new hires, we really have clear leadership for all of the core areas of Cradle-to-Career's work. So, with Sebastian, more bandwidth on procurement and operations, data infrastructure, as I mentioned, Dan's experience that's relevant for the build of the data systems analytical data set. For the data program side of our work, Ryan's depth of experience in data analysis and user-centered design, from the perspective of an educator here in California. And then on engagement, right, Shannon's expertise in comprehensive communications and engagement work with a focus on equity and telling compelling stories with data. So I think we're really excited about the additional bandwidth that we'll have this month to lead our work in our three main areas, right? Our analytical tools, our operational tools, and our community engagement. So welcome to the team, and future welcome to the team for Ryan and Shannon, who will be joining us soon. All right, next up, I wanted to give an update on one additional aspect of our org chart. So we're contracting with the Department of Tax and Fee Administration for the EEO officer role. So we have that in place, and they will also be able to provide diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility resources and training. So we've been able to put that in place as well. And next slide, please. I wanted to flag, we also have two currently open positions. So we have another AGPA position open. This person will work as my assistant and work very closely with me on not only scheduling and some logistical items, but a lot of writing, a lot of strategic projects, partnering closely with me. And really it's an opportunity for someone who's excited to learn more about all of the interesting education, higher education, and other policy and data areas that our work touches. So please share this opportunity widely. It would be a great opportunity perhaps for someone who's early career or someone who really loves to write and wants to engage in our work. And then just this morning, we posted a director of operations position. So you just met 3 of our directors who will lead teams, and this is the 4th and final director role who will lead a team on the org chart as we have it currently envisioned. So this is going to be the position that kind of helps all of our operations administrative work, from HR to procurement and navigating all of the different state processes. So this role would be really great for someone who has deep experience working within the state of California, understands all the ins and outs of the state systems, and would be excited about applying that in a kind of entrepreneurial way and building a new state entity with us. So I would really welcome you all to share a link to our careers page to share these roles. We'll be sending some links around after the meeting so to make it easy for you to do so, but would just really appreciate your help with sharing these positions. If you're dialing in as a member of the public and you're interested in these positions, please apply. And we're happy to help you navigate. You know, if you're within the state, great. If you're new to applying to state positions, we're happy to help you navigate that. Okay. Next update. So that was hiring and team. Wanted to give you an update on our request for proposals. So we have multiple ongoing procurements right now, both related to our technology that we're building and some of our other office work. At the last board meeting, if you recall, we had just released an RFP for a system integrator. We've made a lot of progress over the summer. The bidder proposals have been evaluated and scored, and we're ready to enter the negotiation phase with the bidders. And we've completed PAL stage 3. So do you remember what PAL is? Let's talk about that for a minute. If you can go to the next slide. So as noted in AB 132, we're following the Department of Technology's, or CDT's, project approval lifecycle process for this RFP, for a system integrator RFP that we have open. If you're unfamiliar with the PAL process, I've just put into a slide form here some information from CDT on what those 3 stages are. This is a very detailed process that's intended to help state technology projects get up and running well and ensure that they're properly planned for. This process can take years. And I'm very, very grateful. I just want to give CDT in particular and our many partners across the state, DGS, CalData, and the many others who've been working with us on this, a huge thank you and appreciation that, you know, in basically the last half year, we have made it through stages 1, 2, and 3. Those are approved and signed. And stage 4 will come to a conclusion as we negotiate with select a vendor and finalize that contract. So I'm not going to talk through everything on this slide. There are links to the resources at CDT if you're interested in more details, but I just wanted to highlight what the PAL process is in case you hear about that and where we are in this process. So, you know, I'm very encouraged by the progress we have been able to make on this procurement on a very ambitious timeline. And if you would like more details, or if you get questions about our RFP process, we have a link to our RFP materials on the homepage of the C2C website. If you scroll down, you can find a link to our RFP, and that has a lot of details. So the RFP materials have a statement of work, a detailed list of functional and non-functional requirements. So if you have questions, first of all, please feel free to direct those to us, and we can connect people with questions to our procurement officer. But there's a lot of information available there as well. So wanted to share that highlight. Next up, a few press and engagement highlights since the last board meeting. So if you go to the next slide, as you remember at our board meeting last time, we celebrated the signing of the participation agreement and our legal agreements. The Office of Governor Gavin Newsom released a press release about that. We had a nice article from EdSource that came out right before we launched our first community conversation and helped people know that we were looking for input and got the word out about that. Next. The data quality campaign released a very detailed and nice case study about our work, about the planning process that led to where we are today. And as you can see in the title, how our collective work together here could take the state from last to first. EdSource then wrote an article about that case study as well. Next. And we got another nice article in Government Technology. And then I had a lot of fun doing a cutting edge interview with the EDGE Coalition as well. So it's been really nice to see the enthusiasm for the work and see how this has been highlighted in a number of press opportunities. Additionally, as I mentioned, we launched our community conversation series. Many thanks to Sydney for hosting that. In June, we had our first one, which was a Q&A with myself. And then in July, our community conversations was kind of a demo and Q&A with our partners at californiacolleges.edu. If you remember Ana Castillo, who presented at our February board meeting, she's now in a role with californiacolleges.edu as she goes into college and presented there as well, which was a highlight. For each of these, we had about over 80 people who registered and attended each session. And what was really interesting is most of them were educators and community members where that community conversation event was their first Cradle-to-Career event. So not just those who've been very involved during the planning process and come to many events over the last 2 years, but really new members of the public who are learning about our work. So we hope that this will continue to be an opportunity for us to connect with a wide range of audiences. Now, I want to also share some updates from our partners at californiacolleges.edu. They're now they're set to work with 144 districts, which is up from 106 in the past academic year, and providing approximately 1 million 6th to 12th grade students with accounts on californiacolleges.edu. And there are a number of improvements and highlights that I wanted to flag. So educators can now manage their caseloads of students more efficiently. And there's some student-facing tools that have improved, an improved college search tool, a new skill-focused career assessment, and some updates to the CSU and UC eligibility tools to reflect changes in the A to G course policy. There have also been some improvements made with our partners. So thanks to recent improvements made by UC, Office of the President, students, families, and educators can now track the submission status of their California Community College, Cal State, and UC applications for admission within 24 hours of submission. And thanks to recent improvements made by CSAC, students, families, and educators can track submission status of FAFSA and California DREAM Act applications within 24 hours of submission. So all of these, as we've talked about in our prior meetings, all of these efforts are intended to ease the barriers and hurdles that students face in that important transition and make it easier to navigate that process. One quick operational update. As you can tell, we are meeting virtually today. That's going to be an option for us throughout this fiscal year, so until next July, thanks to a provision in the most recent budget bill. So I just wanted to flag that. If you have thoughts or input on that, feel free to be in touch with Sydney. We expect to hold some of our future board meetings virtually, but perhaps once or twice a year, have a board meeting in person, especially in cases where the agenda has items on it where it might lend itself more towards interacting in person. So we'll be in touch with you about this and make sure that everyone has plenty of time to plan. But again, if you have any thoughts about virtual meetings or preferences, please feel free to be in touch with Sydney and we can take your input into account. So those are some of our highlights that I wanted to share during my update. And now before I jump into the work plan, I wanted to turn it back over to Robert.
Thanks, Marianne. And before we get to the work plan, I wanted to see if there are any questions from the governing board members' comments that you'd like to present to Marianne right now before we transition over to the work plan. If any ideas come up, just feel free to let us know, and then we'll provide the forum for that. But as we pivot now to the C2C work plan, I'd like to take a moment to invite governing board members to share any reflections that you might have from our first year together. Where are we at now? What learnings can we draw from as the 2022-23 year commences? Would any of our board members be interested in offering their ideas, their reflections? Meredith?
Sure, Robert. Thanks for the opportunity. And thanks, Marianne, for that concise update of progress. I definitely agree that the landmark data agreements are a huge milestone. But I'd also like to underscore enthusiasm and appreciation for the effort to build the core team and to really recruit a range of expertise and perspectives. Sometimes org charts are in the background and raised when you fill them in and then tossed aside. I have the one you sent printed out, but I just think it's so important to have a team that is consistently rolling up their sleeves every day. It's essential to delivering on the vision and the promise of the data system. So I'm really excited to see that chart fill in, and as it scales up, I would imagine that our outputs and our outcomes are going to be that much better for it. The second comment just piggybacks on what was said about engagement. It's super exciting to see that after the process to get us to this point, that there's still people showing up at those community virtual or in-person opportunities for the very first time. And there's 40 million people almost in the state, so we have a lot of opportunity for first timers to join. And I really hope that as the office grows, people who are not C2C employees, but are interested in contributing their perspectives will continue to show up and send comments and dial in, that the need for engagement doesn't go away just because the office is becoming more established. Thanks, Robert.
Thanks, Meredith. Any others? Sylvia, please.
Good morning, everyone. I wanted to just reflect on really what tremendous progress we have made in a relatively short period of time. And I just really want to acknowledge that effort, that commitment to really building out the infrastructure for doing really great things under the auspices of Cradle-to-Career. And really the commitment to approaching this work with kind of an esprit de corps and an innovative mindset that I think will serve us really well. Also, on a personal note, want to thank Marianne for keeping really clear, open lines of communication with the advisory board members. I appreciate her little messages and updates, so that when we come to these conversations, we're active, informed, engaged participants, and I really appreciate that extra effort to keep this body fully engaged and participating in the work. So thank you very much, and kudos to all for the tremendous progress.
Thank you, Sylvia. Would any others like to share their ideas? Thomas.
Yeah, thank you. Just wanted to echo the previous comments. We've done so much in 1 year, and the 2 years leading up to this as well. And I know, at the beginning of this entire process 2-3 years ago, we spoke so much about having trust among the work group members, and as this body was being put together, trust among the governing board members. And I think we've really shown that this past year. And kudos and cheers to everyone on the staff and the West Ed staff leading up to this as well. It's been quite the journey, and we're only just beginning on it. So I'm looking forward to continuing to work with all of you and with the public on this. So thank you all.
Thank you, Thomas. We have time for maybe one more. Would anyone like to take the floor?
I'll jump in here. This is John Hinion with Cal HHS, and I was fortunate to have a conversation with Marianne as well. And I want to echo the clear lines of communication, clear strategy. It's a massive effort, and to just see this work coming together, it's very exciting. We're out in year 3 of this initiative, and so obviously our roadmaps, your roadmaps tie together very well. Just very excited for the work, and it's much needed at the state level as well. So thank you.
Thank you, John. We'll have other opportunities, of course, to share our ideas throughout the course of our meeting, but I wanted to give this opportunity just to share reflections and to pause for a moment. I heard notes around the team, lines of communication, the culture that we're building in terms of pushing the envelope on innovation while ensuring there's collaboration and outreach to the community, all of which are central pillars of the work that we're doing. For me, I think back to how 2022-23 really marks our first full year together as a governing board. Of course, our collective work, as mentioned, goes back much longer, but organizationally, we're entering our first full year with our governing board, our C2C office, our advisory boards, and all of our critical institutional foundations in place all at once. Less than a year ago, we were swearing in our governing board members, appointing our executive director, building out our team. We were figuring out how to collaborate and enshrine our work in our governance manual. A mere several months ago, we were looking for partners who can go on this journey with us and share their expertise and lived experiences in our advisory boards, our task forces, and our community conversations. And then just a few months ago, we were issuing RFPs, posting job openings, and most notably formalizing unprecedented legal agreements. So altogether, as mentioned by Sylvia, in less than a full fiscal year, we established the foundation for what promises to be a robust and sustainable data system. But now we turn to a new chapter. And the question is, how can we build upon this foundation and move one step closer towards delivering something truly of value to Californians, especially those with the greatest needs? And how can we start to operationalize our vision and execute our projects? How can we take advantage of the opportunities that we have before us and unlock the potential of, as our friend Ben Chida describes it, the people's data? So these are the challenges that confront us in 2022-23 from my vantage point, putting our shared objectives into action. So let's keep them in mind as we continue with our agenda. And I'll turn it back over now to Marianne.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you for all of those comments and reflections from our other board members. Really appreciate that. So what we're going to do now is walk through the work plans that we have drafted and shared with you. Before I jump into this, I just want to acknowledge that I'm going to screen share PDFs in their entirety, and the text is going to be too small to read. So we have an online link in the slides for future viewing, and we're going to drop into the chat in a moment a link to an online version of this. So if you are depending on the size of the screen that you're viewing this, it might be easier for you to click on that link in the chat and look at the materials that way so that you can zoom in to whatever size you need to be able to read it well. So just wanted to flag that for members of the public. You'll be able to see that link in the chat. All of these materials, all of the materials we're going to be discussing today are also available on that governing board link on our website that I believe Regila put into the chat at the beginning of our meeting. So with that housekeeping note, I want to make sure that everyone can actually read what we're looking at and see it and in a way that works for you. So for this section, I'm going to be sharing two things. One is a 5-year projected timeline. We'll talk about that first. And then the other is a 1-year work plan for the current fiscal year. So we'll talk about the 5-year projected timeline first. And if we can go back to screen sharing, Kathy, that would be helpful. So for the 5-year projected timeline, this really builds on the 5-year plan that was developed and the timeline that was developed during the planning process. So as you may recall, we had a timeline that looked fairly similar to this visually up on our website that was developed during the planning process. And what we did with this projected timeline is account for a lot of the year one activities that weren't incorporated into that original timeline, include those, and then move a lot of the original year one activities to year two. So what do I mean by that? As you know, last year, you as a governing board were seated in November, so that was already 5 months into the fiscal year. And then I came on board in February. The procurement process, because we're going through the PAL process that I talked about during my update, although we expeditiously moved through that in less than a year, that required a bit more time than was anticipated in the original timeline. So what we've done is essentially add a lot of these year one activities that you can see here in green, of all of the original kind of setup work that needed to happen and the planning work for our analytical tools, and then moved a lot of those year one activities to year two. And then we made a choice not to push things out and turn this into a 6-year timeline, but to keep that end date of summer 2026, that's in AB 132, the legislation that established our office, and continue with the momentum that we have to say, let's do our best to build all of the aspects of this data system, and still keep the same finish line of summer 2026. So you can see in year two, we're going to go through a lot of the things that are here in the second column in purple when we get to the 12-month work plan. So I won't go through this in detail, but you can see that there are a variety of things in this 5-year projected timeline. So some of them are things that are required by statute, so that are mentioned specifically in AB 132, like the fact that we will do an annual student experience audit. So we have that mapped out. Other things are kind of in the what will we do first, what will we do next category. So for example, in the analytical tools row, you can see in year 3, 4, and 5, expansions of the data set to include new data. And these are projections from the planning process. There's a reason why it says draft and has revised date up in the upper right-hand corner. This is going to evolve over time, but this is our projected timeline that we're aiming for. So as I mentioned, some required things, some kind of first next things, and then there's some process pieces that are important, but perhaps less at front of mind. So for example, we need to establish office procedures that are reviewed by GovOps, that are reviewed by CalHR, that are reviewed by the unions, and then officially put in place as a new state entity. So the big picture takeaway is this is our 5-year projected timeline. We've filled in some additional details that were missing from the timeline during the planning process and compressed it, and are still keeping the same finish line, if you will, of summer 2026. So that's the 5-year projected timeline. Next, I'll walk through the annual work plan. So this is for the current fiscal year. As a reminder, the state's fiscal year runs from July to July. So we've just, we're about a month and a half into this fiscal year. And this work plan is intended to communicate highlights of our office's planned work for the coming year, and to highlight, what are some of the dependencies, what do we need to do first and next. And I want to acknowledge a couple of things. So this is an ambitious timeline, especially for the first 2 quarters, for the remainder of this calendar year, when we will need to finalize multiple procurements, and where we'll need to work very closely with our data partners on the initial build of the technology infrastructure. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. The other thing, and I said from the beginning, I'll try to be very transparent and open with all of you. We have not built in a bunch of extra buffers into this 12-month plan, and we'll need to be transparent with each other if parts of this timeline need to shift. And part of the reason, the kind of multiple reasons why we decided to do it this way. One is that I think it's important. I think we learned during the pandemic that, things, even major projects like this one, can move expeditiously when we all work together on timelines that are ambitious, and that we can get the work done. The other aspect that I wanted to be transparent about, as I mentioned in our May meeting, we were able to roll over the startup funds, the one-time startup funds that had been allocated for the last fiscal year into this current one. And those rollover funds are intended for use in this current fiscal year. That's what will enable the initial build of the technology. That's what will enable a lot of the important startup work that we need to do. So with that, I think it's important, given that we're already in year 2, to go into this year with an ambitious timeline that helps us keep the momentum that we've built over the last year and really puts us in a position to be able to get to that finish line in 2026. So just wanted to be very transparent about it. We have not, built in lots of extra buffer times. There may be unforeseen things that come up. And if they do, we will share that transparently with you and we will adjust and pivot. So that's kind of the very big picture. What I'll do now is walk through the different components of that work plan and just highlight a few things, and then I'll stop talking and welcome your questions and input. So we've divided up the work plan kind of topically so that you can understand what happens first and next. And again, for those of you, if anyone has just joined us, we have a link in the chat. Perhaps we can repost that in case anyone's joined us in the last few minutes, where you can open this PDF yourself so you can zoom in and see all of the information. So the first section is all about planning and other related activities that are specified in EB 132. So Sydney has been working on resources to support you in developing a strategic plan, and then to also support our office in developing a more operational component for a strategic plan. So we will share more updates with you on that as we move forward with support for that. The next 2 rows is what we're doing today. So as detailed in EB 132, developing annual work plans and annual budgets for your review. And then at the end of our agenda today, I'll also preview a legislative report that will be due next month. So this is kind of just an outline of a few activities that need to happen either on an annual basis or otherwise, and that come up for board review. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the next section of the work plan highlights activities that are very specific to the governing board. So we'll talk later in our agenda about the executive director review process. Advisory boards, as you remember at our last board meeting, you selected members for the advisory board. Because there are rotating terms, that's going to be an annual exercise. So by late spring next year, you will again have the opportunity to select new members for about 1/3 of those advisory board seats. We have a process we've developed over the last 2 meetings on governance manual edits. And then, as you know, we have a process we've now developed for selecting an incoming chair each year for our ongoing leadership. So those are some of the highlights for the governing board's work. All right, this page is all about what we're working on the analytical data system. For our procurements, you can see in the first row, there are a number of contracts that we need to award, not only the system integrator RFP that we talked about in detail, that's the one that's going through the PAL process. We also are awarding contracts for project managers, cybersecurity and privacy analyst, independent verification validation vendor, and multiple technology projects. So that's a lot of what is keeping us busy currently. We'll also, I'll just touch on a few highlights. This fall, we're going to finalize our security and privacy controls and work very closely with our data providers on their review of those security and privacy controls as outlined in the participation agreement. So as you can see in the third row under data provider activities, in this current quarter, we'll ramp up and have more detailed discussions between our technical leads and the technical points of contact at our data providers to ensure we have a good plan in place for data submission and what that process will need to look like. And then the data providers are going to, through the security task force that we talked about in our last meeting, review our security and privacy controls and approve those prior to then having the first data submissions come to Cradle-to-Career. So the next months from now through the end of the year are going to be a period of intense work and very high level of communication between our office and the data providers to ensure that we're getting ready for that first initial build of the data system. And then you can see our plans for our first dashboard, doing a user-centered design process and developing that iteratively with you. So big picture from this page is the rubber's about to meet the road, and we're going to have a lot of intense conversations, high level of communication, and a lot of collaboration with our data providers this fall. That's on the analytical data. Next, we'll talk about our operational tools. So this is largely californiacolleges.edu and also eTranscript California. So what this page highlights is that the work to continue to improve the tools that are available in californiacolleges.edu and putting the building blocks in place for having this scaled statewide involves a lot of collaboration across many different entities. So this is broken up into the work that CCGI is leading, some of the work that we as an office are doing together with them, and working with our partners on, for example, aligning messaging to districts, on the resources that are available at californiacolleges.edu. And then each of our partners, so UC, CDE, CSAC, CSU, are each working on different aspects of how to strengthen the resources that are available at californiacolleges.edu and working towards future expansion statewide and the necessary data collaborations that need to happen for that. So we've done a lot of work on and have a lot of work ongoing with californiacolleges.edu. As you'll remember from AB 132, there's another operational tool called eTranscript California that's also highlighted as something to be scaled up as a part of Cradle-to-Career's work. And so we will also begin more work this year with eTranscript to explore possibilities for the current and future possibilities around making the process of transferring transcripts and giving students access to their transcripts more streamlined. All right, so that's our operational tools page. And then on engagement, we have a number of planned activities, and also, as you know, for all of these areas, as our new directors come on board, we expect these plans to get fleshed out in further detail. So I already mentioned as an example the student experience audit, which we are intending to work as kind of a needs assessment, if you will, to keep us all centered on what students are experiencing today, what barriers and hurdles they face, and how the tools and resources that we're working to create can really help to advance equity and improve the experience of students, especially in navigating important transitions. So this page outlines user-centered design, some planned communications. So in this current quarter, we're working on californiacolleges.edu messaging, and then we'll work on, brand identity development, website improvements, and a lot of that communications and engagement work that Shannon will be leading. Our community conversations we've already talked about, and then our advisory boards. We're going to have our first advisory boards meeting in mid-September as a kind of onboarding and swearing in meeting, and then have additional meetings in the coming quarters where our advisory boards will have an opportunity to reflect on and weigh in and provide recommendations relevant to the work that we're moving forward in each quarter. Okay. And now the last page, I appreciated Meredith's comments on the importance of operations and staffing up. This is the work that kind of happens invisibly behind the scene, but that's also incredibly important. So as we talked about initially, staffing up, continuing to finalize job descriptions, do the appropriate reclassifications, onboard people onto the team, and filling our positions this year is going to be one of our top priorities. And then there are a lot of HR, leadership, and staff development activities that we're going to pair with that. The third row talks about space. I just wanted to highlight this because I've talked with some of you about this, but perhaps not all. We were very fortunate from day one. We were able to walk in the door and occupy space at 400 R Street that Census had previously had. So we had desks and cubicles ready to go, and we're able to have a physical presence for those of us who wanted to be in the office or needed to be in the office. But we're building a remote-centric team, and the space that we currently have is in a very large space that has kind of a sea of cubicles, but not meeting space that we need for the in-person or virtual or hybrid events that we will host, not only for our formal meetings like this governing board meeting or our advisory board meetings, but also the other community engagement work that we need to do. So we've been fortunate to work with DGS, the Department of General Services in California, who are helping us find, secure, and then negotiate permanent space, where I think we'll be able to use effective use of our resources to move to a small and compact remote-centric space that does not have, lots of individual large offices for staff who are mostly remote, but rather really centers a space that can be a place where we can gather either in person or hybrid or virtually for all of our community engagement and board meetings. So I just wanted to highlight that. That's going to be a bit of a lift this year too, and be an opportunity for us to find space, renovate it, and then move into it hopefully by next summer. And then, as I highlighted before, policies and procedures, there are a lot of policies, procedures, manuals, plans that each state entity needs to have. And so we're developing those in collaboration with CalHR, with GovOps, and having the proper review of those. I also already mentioned the EEO position and DEIA services, as well as our procurements. So that was a very long-winded walkthrough of some of the highlights, but I just wanted to spell some of those pieces out and would welcome any comments or questions. Robert, perhaps back over to you to facilitate any comments or questions that board members have.
Thank you, Marianne. It looks like Gavin's ready for a question or comment, so I'll turn it over to you, sir.
No question, just mostly a comment. I love the idea of a buffer-free zone and applaud you for being disciplined about that. There are so many dependencies with all of the data providers and other agencies, and just sort of inside the maw of state government that you sort of praise to you and the team for grabbing the reins and making sure that we can follow the timelines that we've set out for ourselves. And so honestly, you can probably count on all the board members to help with that if you need be.
Thank you. Others? Marisol?
Thanks, Robert, and thank you, Marianne, for laying out our ambitious work plan for the next 12 months and our bigger picture for the next 5 years. Just wanted to, and I hope this is the right time to bring this up, but just wanted to lift up what you and I talked about previously, and that is, in the context of this next 12 months, and particularly as we look at the analytical data piece of the work plan and the security piece. I know this fall is going to be where those activities are going to be taking place. And so, one of the things I just wanted to lift up is with regards to undocumented students and their data and the security of their data, because I feel like this is, there's just, it's a more nuanced, conversation. I know security, we're very intentional about security, just in general. And while we don't ask immigration status, and in any of our K-12 data points, etc. I do wonder whether in that process of matching data and with other data sets, whether there may be, you may be able to conclude some students are undocumented, and so how that data is just safeguarded. So just kind of wanted to, lift that up just in the context of our next 12 months, since I know those activities are going to be very intense in the fall. And I know the advisory boards are going to be potentially tackling some of it, but, just want us to be intentional in lifting that up.
Yes. Thank you for highlighting that. That's an incredibly important point. And I know that this was discussed extensively during the planning process, and that there's no plan to include immigration status in the status system. And that point that you're mentioning on ensuring that we're protecting the privacy of all students, and especially of those who are undocumented, is something that we need to continue to have at the forefront of our minds. And that I know, from conversations with Kathy about the planning process as well, and then going through the 200 data points, was that this was included in the review of those data points to ensure that that's an aspect that we keep in mind in building the data system. So thank you very much for lifting that up.
Thank you, Marisol. Are there any other comments or questions regarding the work plan?
And we do have one public comment. So board members, before we get to that public comment, board members, if you have any other questions or comments first, and then we'll go ahead and get into public comment afterwards.
Seeing none at the moment, so Sydney, let's turn over to public comment.
Okay, perfect. So first up is Liz Gulligan. Please forgive me if I completely butchered your last name. Rajiel, can you go ahead and unmute Liz?
Good morning. Am I being heard?
Yes. And please, can you share how to pronounce your last name too? Because I know we see you on calls often, and I want to make sure I acknowledge that.
Thank you. I'm Liz Guillen.
Okay.
The L's are like tortilla. I'm of counsel with Public Advocates. And I have to say, once an immigrant advocate, always an immigrant advocate. And I wanted to echo some of the concerns that board member Aviña raised. While not asking for immigration status specifically is important, there are other data points that can flag undocumented immigration status. And I really hope that protecting privacy includes looking at how other data points collected together can lift up vulnerable status. And I think a user-centered approach is really great for this, for identifying this, for undocumented students and people, as well as other vulnerable populations like the incarcerated and people that have used services. If I have a little time, I'd like to also take this moment to congratulate the new board members. I was happy to see their names, and also to share our excitement at the progress that the system has made. As you know, Public Advocates has been an advocate for a long time on the importance of information for people to make improvements in their lives and to be empowered. So this is really thrilling to see how far you've gone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz. Sydney, are there other public comments?
Yes, so far we have two. I will read one from Raquel Morales from the Education Trust West. She says, we are in strong support of the continued expansion of analytical data sets, especially as it relates to early learning and care data. As California continues to prepare for this integration, we hope to see an extensive comprehensive plan for linking early learning and care to C2C and greater alignment between all agencies. And then we have two more comments. Rajiel, can you go ahead and unmute Chantel Lamarelle? This is really testing my ability to read names, so please forgive me if I'm butchering anyone's name. Chantel, if you're on, feel free to unmute yourself.
Hello, I appreciate the time. My name is Chantal Lamarelle, and I am an associate professor for child development and education at Santa Ana College, an EEO monitor for our district, an academic senator, and newly appointed student equity faculty coordinator, and a governor at large for the Faculty Association for California Community Colleges, and a PhD doctoral candidate in P through 20 education. So this is a passion of mine, and I'm so encouraged to see the movement of this group occurring. I would like to ask or encourage this board as it moves through its work and plans that we align all the verbiage and messaging for the inclusion of preschool or PK in state initiatives, laws, funding streams, RFPs, data platforms, and with our stakeholders at large. It's important that we begin to continue to plant the seeds that the PK or TK through 12, especially with our state chancellor's office, Department of Education, and governor's office, that it's the beginning of the education system and the seamless education system of quality care. Oftentimes, the verbiage is still stating K through 12 for funding sources, as well as RFPs and on committees. And so I would just like us to encourage to work towards planting those seeds of inclusion for P through 12, especially with the movement towards creating a PK through third grade credential from the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing in the next year. So it's a really exciting time for early care and education, and the work that we have all been doing in this field to create more synergy and alignment between all of our levels of education. I'd also like us to look at the participants that are on these boards to make sure that early care and educators are included and professionals are included on these boards, that there is a different education and backgrounds from individuals that have a degree in early care and education versus education as a whole. So to make sure that there's representation from early care and educators at the table. And lastly, to look at our CTE demographics and what we are projecting or illustrating as far as careers or successful careers within the field of early care and education. Child museum professionals, child life specialists, or college professors at community colleges and universities, salaries are not included oftentimes in the CTE information. So it's giving a skewed view of the potential and the possibilities for individuals to make a sustainable and successful career within the field of early care and education. Again, I appreciate the time and the energy that this group is putting into this work, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Chantel. So we have another public comment, and just a reminder to our public commenters that there is a 2-minute time limit. That's just to make sure that we keep on pace with the remainder of the meeting agenda. So please keep your comments to 2 minutes. Next up, we have Roxana Marachi, I believe. Regil, if you can unmute Roxana, that'd be great.
Hi there, good morning. I hope you can all hear me. I am Dr. Roxana Marashi. I'm on the San Jose Silicon Valley NAACP Executive Committee, and I am a former education chair for the California State NAACP, also an education professor, researcher of emerging technologies at San Jose State University. I'm not representing my university in this call. I wanted to thank you for the updates. I've been analyzing some of the materials describing the project. It appears that some of the skills and competency tracking will be pitched on emerging technologies, including blockchain-based verification and credentialing systems. I'm wondering if the governing board would be able to confirm whether or not blockchain-based IDs would be used in these data systems. If so, if there's been any kind of a briefing regarding the privacy and security concerns with the use of these systems. Just over a month ago, over 1,500 technologists and computer scientists had recently sent a letter to Congress documenting serious concerns with blockchain-based digital ledgers and systems. I have a link in the chat there. And then I'd just be curious if it would be possible to add this as a future agenda items. I'm looking at a lot of the workforce development initiatives boasting about these kinds of new technologies that have not been built and have not actually been confirmed to be secure or private. They have very, very serious problems. Also, the NAACP has passed a resolution at the national level, at the state and national level, opposing the use of blockchain digital ID systems again, because of many of these concerns. That was back in 2019, because before it's become more in the mainstream, but I do hope that the committee will address this. Oftentimes the language of blockchain is not upfront, but the systems are underneath in the back end. So I hope that you'll take these concerns seriously, and I look forward to hearing more, and also I'm glad to offer briefings and concerns if there would be interest. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And I see no other public comment at this time.
Thanks to all the members of the public for sharing their ideas, as well as to members of our governing board for both their questions and remarks. At this time, it's that point where we entertain a motion. So is there a motion from our governing board?
So moved.
I'll second.
And I'm sorry, for record keeping, who made the original motion?
Lonjay?
Thank you.
And the second came from
Gavin.
Gavin Payne. Sydney, would you like us to do vote by chat or individually by audio?
I can go ahead and do a roll call vote just for simplicity. So I have the original motion made by Londe, seconded by Gavin. I'll just go down really quickly. Jerry Winkler.
Yes.
John Hetz.
Yes.
Sylvia Alva.
Yes.
Chris Virtuelli.
Yes.
Thomas Vu.
Yes.
Debbie Cochran.
Yes.
Patrick Perry.
Yes.
David DeGuire.
Yes.
John Ohanian. John, are you there? Let's see. If John's not there, Elizabeth, can you vote on his behalf?
Yes.
Okay. Javier Romero.
Yes.
Let's see. Catalina Cifuentes.
Yes.
Robert Tagorda.
Yes.
Londia Jose.
Yes.
Gavin Payne.
Yes.
Salavina.
Yes.
Hujan Jez.
Yes.
Sean Elo Rivera.
Yes.
Meredith Lee.
Yes.
Let's see. Dante Golden for Senator Laird.
Yes.
And Assemblymember Jackie Irwin.
Yes.
Perfect. We have unanimous votes for yes. Thank you.
Thank you. And we've reached a point on our agenda where there is a 10-minute break scheduled. Marianne, are we keeping that break?
I think everyone would appreciate a break from Zoom. So
Let's
yes.
do it. Let's do it. So 10 minutes. What time should we reconvene? 10.
So that was
10.
Yeah, to 10:47. So we'll reconvene at 10:47. Feel free to just turn off your videos and go on mute, and then we'll be back in 10 minutes.
Thank you.
Just to let folks know, this is a 3-minute warning. We'll reconvene in 3 minutes. Thank you. This is another heads up. We will reconvene in 1 minute. So please start, I guess, getting back to your computer if you left, and we'll reconvene in 1 minute. Okay, it is 10:47, so we will go ahead and reconvene the meeting. Robert, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sydney. We're going to move forward with our agenda, talking now about the budget. So let me turn it over to Mary Ann Bates, our Executive Director, to present on this topic.
Thank you, Robert. So thank you to both the public and the board for input on the work plan that we just discussed. That work plan is a helpful context now for talking about the budget request that we're putting together. So what I'll do next is talk about the process and then highlight a couple of the high notes from the budget concept that we posted online. And again, as I mentioned previously, we're going to be talking about a number of materials where we'll put links in the chat so that you can look at that on your own screen and be able to read it well. All right, so we'll go to the next slide. So the state budget process, just to orient ourselves again, remember the fiscal year begins in July and goes through the following June. So we've just started the current fiscal year 22-23, but we're already talking about the fiscal year that's going to start next summer. So the state budget process, what's going to happen in July and August is that departments and agencies work on budget change concepts and then submit what's called a budget change proposal to the Department of Finance by the end of this month. That then is iterated on in the fall. In January, as you know, the governor submits a proposed budget. Then in the spring, we have the legislative budget subcommittees and budget hearings. And then in the summer, a budget for the upcoming fiscal years passed. So where are we in the process? What we're talking about right now, and the budget concept note that is up for your review as a board is for the budget that would begin next summer. So we're talking about the fiscal year 23-24. So that's kind of big picture where we are. I will say, in Sydney's wisdom in planning our board meetings over the 9 months ago, having this meeting happen at this point in August actually works quite well, because what we've been able to do is develop this budget change concept that you are reviewing together with GovOps. So they've reviewed it. With your review and approval, we can then work with GovOps and with our board chairs to develop a formal budget change proposal with detailed justifications in the coming weeks, and then iterate and answer any questions this fall as we get further details. So that's kind of big picture where we are in the process. Okay, context for the budget request. And again, if we could put the link to the budget note in the chat, you can see this in greater detail. But as I mentioned at the beginning, we have approximately $10 million in ongoing annual funding for our office. In the current fiscal year, so fiscal year 22-23, the one that has just started, we also have access to about $13 million in one-time startup funding. These are the funds that we rolled over from last year and that are available for this current fiscal year. So our total funding for this current fiscal year is about $23 million. Next year, absent any action from you as a board and us as an office, we would drop from that $23 million to $10 million in ongoing funding. And the budget note that you are reviewing gives us the ability to request an increase of up to $5 million for a total of about $15 million for the upcoming fiscal year. So that's kind of the very overarching big picture of the draft budget request. Okay, for context, I wanted to share this online link to our draft org chart. In a moment, I'll walk through the proposed positions that are part of this request. But if you want to see that in context with our already hired members of the team, other planned positions, and the proposed positions, you can look at this draft org chart online as well, which I believe Sydney has now put into the chat as well. So that resource is there for you to see. If we can go to the next slide. So what is the proposed request? The budget requests are basically divided into two overarching components. One is operating costs and the other is staff positions. So on this, the operating costs portion, we're requesting approximately $2 million. And the reason we're requesting that is to partially manage the shift from having $23 million available in the current year to going back to $10 million in annual funding next year. So this would be an increase in operating costs. There are a couple of factors that motivate this, and in a moment would welcome your input and thoughts, because that can help shape how we could frame this in a formal budget change proposal as well. So one aspect that we're considering is with the non-trivial inflation that we've seen more recently. We anticipate that that's something we will need to thoughtfully plan for across a variety of our expenses, but especially in IT and technology costs. And the last point that I wanted to share, and this is where your direction as a board would also be really helpful. And that is, ensuring that we have sufficient operating expenses for the heart of our work. So what I mean by that is, we have this vision of building the most inclusive data system for California, of ensuring that we have the staff and the resources to be able to engage deeply with communities, to do that user-centered design, to ensure that we're getting input from the whole range of California's communities, the 40 million people that we've been alluding to in our work, and ensuring that we're really doing this work in a thoughtful way with a lot of public engagement and with inclusivity and accessibility at the forefront of what we're doing. And some things in budgets, can kind of contract and expand like an accordion, and other things can't. And I think it's really important for us to think about how we can ensure that we have sufficient resources, not just for the technical build of the data system, but for all of the work that surrounds that will really make the Cradle-to-Career data system what its vision is and what it needs to be. So that's kind of big picture on the operating costs. And then we have 7 new positions that I'll walk through in a moment that would require additional funding, and some of the reclassifications that we've done in creating the career executive assignment director level positions that we're filling will need adjustments for in the budget as well. So if we can now go to the positions. So there are 7 proposed positions. We have assistant directors of legislative affairs, external affairs, and data programs. So on the first 2, one important piece of context to think through, we're housed within GovOps, who have been very welcoming and generous with their time hosts for helping us stand up this new state entity. GovOps has historically not been as engaged in education and higher education policy and budget areas. So their recommendation, the GovOps leadership's recommendation, was that having our own bandwidth, especially on comms and legislative affairs, would be helpful and useful, because that's been outside of kind of the realm of work GovOps has traditionally focused. The Assistant Director of Data Programs position is going to spearhead our work with California Colleges.edu and eTranscript California. So this will be a position that will be able to leverage the ongoing support that we're providing and also work through the decisions we need to make between now and 2026 on how we will partner with these entities moving forward. Okay, next, please. So the remaining, that was 3 positions, the remaining 4 of the 7. We have an Assistant Director of Data Infrastructure position, which we're planning to call our Principal Data Architect, who will work closely with Dan to ensure the successful development of the data system. Part of the reason why we're structuring the org chart in this way to have directors over certain areas and then assistant director positions is to ensure that we have sufficient bandwidth and leadership, and also some I don't want to use the word redundancy, that's not the right term, but I think if we've learned anything from the COVID pandemic, it's to ensure that, especially when we're building something like this, we have multiple people in place who can cross-train and have expertise in the different areas of the work. And so that, for example, our data infrastructure knowledge doesn't rest solely just with one person. And the same is true for other areas of work. So that's something that we've been thinking about as we develop this org chart. The next position is a Staff Services Manager 1 specialist who would serve as a board coordinator and report to Sydney to provide additional bandwidth to serve all of you, our 21-person governing board, in addition to the 32 members of our 2 advisory boards and all of the logistical work and coordination work that goes along with planning this meeting and keeping you all informed. We're also requesting an additional AGPA position that would focus more on the budget to complement Sebastian's work in procurement and contracts, and then an office technician who could support 2 directors and assistant directors and do additional operational work kind of across the office. So those are the 7 proposed positions. So where are we in the process? So again, the next steps would be that we as an office would work with the Cradle-to-Career board chairs to finalize a formal budget change proposal submission in collaboration with GovOps leadership and the Department of Finance. So what you're reviewing today, again, is a budget change concept. And with your approval, we would then transform that into a formal budget change proposal and then work with the Department of Finance in the coming weeks and months on any questions and details that they have on that, and then go into the formal budget process starting in January. So those are the updates that I have. Back over to Robert for facilitating any conversation or questions about that.
Thank you, Marianne. I'd like to turn it over to the board now to see if there are any questions, comments. Patrick?
Hi there. Are the assistant director positions you're talking about here that you're putting in the VCP, are those low-level CEA positions or high-level civil service manager positions? What are you thinking?
So it varies. The assistant directors of data programs, external affairs, and ledge affairs are planned to be CEA-A and CEA-B.
Okay.
This is all subject to Department of Finance approval. The assistant director of data infrastructure or the principal data architect is planned to be an IT manager 2 position, which is a senior level civil service position. For clarity, for those of you who are unfamiliar with state hiring, the career executive assignment positions, or CEA, are also civil service positions. Those are kind of the senior level civil service positions. And then there are a number of civil service classifications in different areas like IT manager 2 that are not CEA, but that are senior level. And if you zoom in really far on that very small font org chart that I linked to, for many of the positions, we included that classification. So you can see either the name of the person who has the position now, or it will say vacant. And then the next row has the kind of title we use. So that would be like principal data architect. And then the next row in the box shows what the classification is. So that might say like IT manager 2 or CEA-B. So you can see what the level is of the position. So it's kind of the name, the title we use on a day-to-day basis, and then what classification that corresponds to in the state. Thank you for that question.
Chris.
Yes, thank you, Marianne, for sharing that. I think it's very clear, and I I agree wholeheartedly with requesting additional resources to ensure adequate support to build an effective infrastructure for the system, and also to ensure adequate staffing to ensure the community engagement and participation that everyone expects and values out of the system. My question is whether I'm thinking of contingencies because of our previous conversation about the work plan being a no buffer zone and no provisions for time slippage. What are your thoughts on potential threats to this work plan timeline if either the additional funding is not approved or difficult to get approved, or if the additional inflationary cost coverage proves insufficient?
Thank you for that question. If this funding request were not to be approved and we would need to operate based with the $10 million, I think we would want to reconvene as a group and make some decisions about what to prioritize. And that's something where I would really appreciate the board's input. That's not something that I would want to make a decision on unilaterally, or our office should take unilaterally. And I think the reality is, there are ways in which we can scale our work back or expand it. I think the work that we're doing is incredibly important and powerful. And as the way that I've heard Ben Cheetah frame this is, California is making like a $170 billion play in education, and this data system can be a backbone of that. So I think as we're thinking about the resources we're requesting, it's helpful to frame it in the context of these truly historic investments that California is making across the education spectrum and what we need there. So, to ensure that I'm directly answering your question, I think if the budget request were not approved and we would need to operate with $10 million, I would want to come to the board with a variety of options that say, here is the plan, here's what we had wanted to do. If we only have these resources, here's where we would need to cut back or delay. But my final thought on that is that I think the position I want to make sure we avoid is one in which we don't request the resources that we anticipate we might need, and then be in a position a couple of years from now to say, well, we didn't achieve what we had hoped to, we didn't request the resources we needed to, and now we're not where we wanted to be by the final destination. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. I just want to make sure that there's awareness on the board of any potential support or advocacy that would be needed to help ensure the acquisition of the additional resources, and in worst case scenarios that we're fully prepared with contingency plans and timeline adjustments to adjust. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Debbie?
Hi, thank you so much. I really appreciate the comments, particularly in how, Marianne, you're thinking about leadership and kind of not necessarily duplication, but kind of making sure that that the team is being built up in a way that can survive any one individual loss and really be as robust as possible. The one question that I would have, and just to put out there for you all to consider, is whether or not you'll have enough folks to kind of keep the wheels turning in terms of the day-to-day operations. I'm thinking, in all the wonderful engagement materials, making sure the margins are aligned well and font sizes are all correct, or for some of the engagement activities in the office space, who's handling any sort of questions about parking reimbursements or logistics like that. I just, those aren't typically done by someone at, a CEA level or at a level of a 2 or a 3. And it doesn't look, I see a lot of growth in that leadership, but I want to make sure you would have enough support to make sure that leadership can really thrive.
Thank you so much for highlighting that. You're highlighting something that is a natural result of the fact that we reclassified existing positions that were in our org chart in order to be able to develop that strong leadership bench. So I think that's incredibly helpful feedback. It's something that we've been weighing, and to your point, right, who's going to handle the reimbursements and do the copy editing, et cetera, and all of that important work. I think the the request as we put it together right now is trying to balance what requests we think will be feasible, especially if the budget outlook is a bit different from what we experienced this past summer. But that's a very good point, and that's something that we can definitely take into consideration and think about whether a couple more, rank and file positions is something we would want to build in at the budget change proposal stage in the coming weeks. So thank you for that.
Gavin?
Thank you, Marianne. In fact, what I was going to talk about, what I was going to say was exactly what you just identified. That we've had a number of really good years, and I think we're going into a period where it's not going to be as good. My first reaction would have been, let's ask for more. Let's ask for more. Perhaps it's informed by my experience, sort of in the 8 years that I was at the Department of Ed. 6 of them were cut years, and so I sort of built this sort of money grubbing attitude with regard to the game of state service and budget and procurement. But I think we're looking at a couple of lean years, and I think we're already seeing that in the receipts. The Department of Finance is talking about. I think next year's budget conversation is going to be quite substantially different than this year's was, and in that context, I think what you've built here is a really responsible, really sort of responsive proposal to do what we need to do going forward. I would want us to make sure that sort of as we're doing this and as we're sort of engaging with our loose confederation of a number of agencies probably asking for the same thing, we consider this and we try to establish this as a new base for the organization going forward, and that we can then just build upon that if the opportunity arises.
Thank you, Gavin. Sylvia.
Thank you. So I want to offer my support for this budget proposal. I do have two important points to make, and that is, one of the first is that with so much hiring, I think it's really important that we be very intentional and really lean into ensuring that we have robust and diverse pools of applicants. And as we're trying to build out these organizations and our own internal processes are still under development, I want to just be on record how important it is for me that we create career opportunities for individuals that reflect California's diversity and ensure that we commit to really being very intentional in robust and diverse pools of applicants. The other point that I wanted to make is one, when I reflect on sort of the news that I hear about California and its one-time sort of allocations of dollars, is I invite you, Marianne, to think about what things can be put on a one-time, short-term sort of investment. You talked about new space, perhaps needing to, equip that space to function for you, versus things that require permanent base positions. So salaried personnel, of course, require permanent, but I'd be ready to have a little bit of each, right? What's in your permanent request list? What's in your one-time? Because I think increasingly, I see the governor really entertaining these multi-year agreements. We're certainly in such an agreement with him around the compact. Are there opportunities to say, okay, we may not have all of it in base, but maybe give us a 1 year allocations, and then by year 3 or year 4, we start to make these permanent base conversions from annual to permanent. So I just sort of put that out there as a strategy that you should consider as we think about where the state's economic situation is today and likely to be in the future. So thank you again. But overall, the plan makes a lot of sense to me.
Thank you for that feedback. That will be incredibly helpful, and we can consider that as we develop the formal budget change proposal. And thank you also for highlighting the importance of ensuring we have robust and diverse applicant pools as we do a lot of hiring over the next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Any other board members who'd like to share a comment or question before we move to public comment? Marisol?
Thank you, Robert. And just real quick, echoing and ditto to everything that has been previously said. The one thing that I would just add is, Marianne, you described really great, our really important value of ensuring authentic and robust community engagement, and partly why we have this proposal is to ensure that we don't compromise on some of those things that we value so highly. And as I read it and I hear you talk about it and I hear this conversation, I think it's important to uplift and highlight what that looks like in terms of the user-centric and the ensuring that this system reaches California's diverse population. So I know you talked about language access, and all of these other things that are like critical for our communities that will be using the system. So just really to the extent that can be uplifted in the write-up, I think that would be great.
Thank you for that. And that's something that we can spell out in more detail and emphasize more in the budget change proposal. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Marisol. Any other board members before we proceed to public comment? Seeing none, Sydney, are there any public comments?
No, I did not see any public comment at this time. So
with that,
oh, sorry, I was going to say we can do like just a last call for public comment. If you would like to submit public comment, please do so in the Q&A. And I guess we can give it just a couple more seconds. Nope, we have not received anything. So we can go ahead and move forward.
thank you. I wanted to, before we get into, there's a vote associated with this, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Let me troubleshoot the slides. Give me one moment.
No problem. As you're working on that, Sydney, I wanted to uplift what all of the board members have already stated regarding the budget, because I think it enshrines a lot of the values that we espouse in the organization. The continued focus on equity, both in hiring as well as in how we outreach to our community, with a specific focus on vulnerable groups, undocumented students, for example, being one of those that have been highlighted during the course of our conversation. The idea that we want to navigate some potentially challenging fiscal environments in the future. The idea that we're continuing to pursue a very aggressive but important timeline, but we want to build in the flexibility to be able to adjust as necessary with input from the board. And the idea that while we want to continue to keep our eyes on the big picture, we also want to make sure that we don't forget about the day-to-day tasks that an office requires in order to be fully operational. So I appreciate the board for highlighting all those points, because I think these are the same themes that will continue to emerge for us as we proceed with our timeline as well as with our budget. Sydney.
Thank you, Robert. So I think we are working on the slide. Give us one moment, and then Kathy will go ahead and reshare her screen.
So simple motion here. I'd like to call for a governing board member to move.
This is Tom. I move.
This is Sylvia Alba. I second the motion.
Tom Vu moves, Sylvia Alba seconds, and time for a vote. Sydney.
Okay, so I'll run through this really quickly again. Jerry Winkler?
Yes.
Hetz, John Hetz?
Yes.
Sylvia Alva,
Yes.
Christopher Joelle,
Yes.
Thomas Vu,
Yes.
Debbie Cochran,
Yes.
Patrick Perry,
Yes.
David DeGuire,
Yes.
John Ohanian or Elizabeth Stephenson if he's not on.
Yes.
Okay. Let's see. Javier Romero,
Yes.
Catalina Cifuentes,
Yes.
Robert Tagorda,
Yes.
Landea Jose,
Yes.
Gavin Payne,
Yes.
Marisol Lavinia,
Yes.
Sujin Jez,
Yes.
Sean Elo Rivera,
Yes.
Meredith Lee.
Yes.
Let's see. Dante Golden for Senator Laird. Dante Golden, are you online?
Sorry, I've had technical difficulties. Yes, I'm online.
No worries. And Assembly Member Jackie Irwin.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. We have a unanimous vote of yes.
Thank you for that discussion. And now we'll move on to our next agenda item, which is the Executive Director Review Ad Hoc Committee Report Out. And at this time, I'd like to invite Elizabeth Stephenson to present the findings and the results from the work of the Ad Hoc Committee.
Great. Thank you so much, Robert, and good morning, all. I am Elizabeth Stephenson. I'm with the Center for Data Insights and Innovation at the California Health and Human Services Agency. And I've really had the pleasure of working with several fellow board members during this ad hoc committee. To briefly review the committee charter, the Executive Director Review Process Ad Hoc Committee shall recommend the criteria and process that will be used to conduct the annual review of the C2C Executive Director. We met 2 times. The first was on June 29th and the second on July 11th. We were 6 members on this ad hoc committee, Chris Fergiarelli, Meredith Lee, Gavin Payne, myself, Wesley Whitaker, and Jerry Winkler. And I just want to call out before we jump into all of the remaining slides that there were a number of considerations that went into this process. We talked about the roles, we talked about the timeline, the process steps involved, and of course the actual review categories. It was an incredibly thoughtful group. I just really appreciate the mindfulness and critical thinking that went into this process. And so we'll start on the next slide with the actual roles of who all is involved. The presiding governing board chair and the ad hoc committee members are the primary groups who will be leading and facilitating the executive director review process. The governing board chair would lead the performance review process, and the ad hoc committee aggregate the information gathered and fill in the performance review form, and then present that review to the governing board in a closed session. And the ad hoc committee members are responsible for identifying performance targets related to the annual plan, selecting individuals to complete the performance review, reviewing the performance review form that was compiled by the governing board chair, and participate in the performance review meeting with the executive director. Now, if identified as a need, the ad hoc committee can bring on external human resource consultants to support the actual conducting of the performance review. So this is an optional role in this process. And the next few roles are those who would actually be completing the performance review. So the executive director would complete a self-review, and then board members, staff, and external stakeholders would also complete the performance review. The governing board chair-elect would provide engagement and support by reviewing the performance review form before it's shared with the ad hoc committee. So we're going to bring these roles and connect them to the timeline and major components, and in the following slides we'll talk about each of these components in turn. So in August, the governing board will approve the annual work plan. They will also form the ad hoc committee. In September, the ad hoc committee comes in to align the review criteria and select the review participants, the individuals who will be completing the executive director review form. In October, information gathering processes will begin. This is where you see the majority of the roles coming in. The ad hoc committee is still leading this process. External HR consultants can be brought in if needed. And then, of course, you see the folks who are going to be completing the review. In December, or by the end of December, we would have completed the initial draft of the review. The presiding governing board chair will be in charge of that process, which would be also reviewed by the board chair-elect. In January, the review would be discussed with the executive director and the ad hoc committee. And in February, it would be discussed in a closed session of the governing board, led by the presiding governing board chair. So let's break this down a little bit more if we go on to the next slide. The planning process covers the August to September piece, right? So in August, the governing board chair will review and also approve the annual work plan and form the executive director review ad hoc committee. The ad hoc committee will start their work in September. They will specify the expected the expected outcomes under each area of responsibility based on the annual work plan. And the intent here is to have really relevant and meaningful review criteria rather than having it just be more generic. In September also, the ad hoc committee will identify at least 5 individuals to complete the performance review. We want to make sure that individuals who are going to be completing this review have awareness that this is going to be their responsibility coming up and can be mindful and thoughtful throughout the performance period to produce, just a very thoughtful review later down the road. The actual reviewers will be drawn from the governing board, from staff, and from other relevant stakeholders. And there will be selection criteria at play here to ensure that qualified reviewers are selected. So those selection criteria include that they have been involved in C2C for the entire performance period. They are aware of the strategic priorities for the year. They are not serving on the executive director review ad hoc committee. And we're also recommending that we limit the number of individuals who participated in prior year reviews. So we didn't want to give a solid can or cannot, figuring that the ad hoc committee should be free to pick the best qualified individuals, but we do want to limit. And then to the degree possible, the reviewers' identities will remain anonymous through this process. So this is the first piece, August, September. Next piece starts in October with the gathering of information. So we'll utilize feedback surveys to solicit information about specific actions and behaviors of the executive director. This is the process, this information process that can be supported by external HR consultants. And for all of the reviewers, there will be an informational session on how to complete the form. Also in October, we'll start having folks complete their surveys. So the executive director will complete their self-review, and then the reviews from the individuals previously selected will also be completing their reviews. So we have the result of a 360 review happening. In or by December, the board chair will review the information and complete a formal performance review form, which the board chair-elect will review. And then the ad hoc committee will meet before the review form is shared with the executive director to discuss the review form among themselves and also discuss and make recommendations to modify the executive director's compensation. And then by the end of December, the board chair will finalize the evaluation. So the next piece of this happens in January, where the review or information sharing with the executive director occurs. So the ad hoc committee, of course, led by the board chair, will review the performance review form with the executive director. And the executive director will have draft to review 1 week in advance of that meeting. The ad hoc committee members and the executive director during that conversation will also develop priorities for professional development for the upcoming year. And at the conclusion of this process, the presiding board chair will finalize the performance review. In February, on the next slide, the performance review will be finalized. So in a closed session, the governing board will discuss the final draft of the performance review and will move to modify or approve that review. The board chair will also submit recommendations regarding compensation to the Government Operations Agency. And we're just noting here that if the governing board determines that the executive director is not fulfilling the expectation for their role, and of course in accordance with Cal HR policies, it may terminate the contract through a 2/3 vote. So this is the process, sort of beginning to end, August to February. And starting on the next slide, we'll be covering what the actual performance measure areas are. This was a lot of conversation to come up with really meaningful categories that weren't the whole kitchen sink, but really did embody what the role is intended to do. So we have 3 major areas of leadership, stakeholder and community engagement, and system management. And there are opportunities to provide specific feedback in kind of a quantitative rating category for each of the bullets you see here. So under leadership, that the executive director advances the C2C vision, embodies inspirational leadership, displays cultural competence, ethics, and continuous improvement. For stakeholder and community engagement, there are opportunities to speak to the communication strategy, the relationship with the governing board, and relationships with the communities. We did specifically call out the relationship with the governing board intentionally, knowing that this is a critical relationship to support the overall success of the project. So even if reviewers are not part of that governing board, we wanted to make sure that this was something that we called out specifically in the form. Under system management, the executive director will be reviewed on their planning and organization, financial sustainability, and data privacy and security. So on the next slide is a link to the actual form. Never mind, it's not. My apologies. What we have here is a cut and paste. So you can see what's actually on the form. There's two parts to it. The first part is really qualitative, just important questions to ask and the reviewer's response to those questions and whatever way they'd like to respond to those questions. So the key questions here are, what have been the most significant achievements over the past year? What are the major strengths that contribute to the executive director's performance? What are some areas for growth? Also asking, in the past year, what difficult issues, if any, have faced C2C, and how did the executive director bring them to resolution? We are asking what are the areas in which the governing board could provide better support? What are the areas that the executive director could better support various stakeholder groups? And what action items should the executive director prioritize related to professional development for the coming year? And then, of course, throughout the form, there are opportunities for additional comments for anything a reviewer would like to expound on or add to. The second section of the form is this sort of more quantitative section where it's covering those 3 major areas and subsections for the core skills, with an opportunity for reviewers to identify whether they don't know, whether they identify improvement is needed, if the performance was satisfactory, very good, or outstanding. And then, of course, we would request examples for each of those ratings. On the last slide here, we're showing each of those categories. So I know this is pretty small, but thanks, Sydney, for linking to the actual form. But these are showing each of those categories that we talked about: leadership, stakeholder and community engagement, and system management, and the specific criteria that we're looking at in each of the subcategories related. So I think that the final product here was the executive review policy document as well as the review form. Robert, do I hand it back over to you?
Yes, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for the summary. And I wanted to first, thank you and other members of the ad hoc committee for the collective effort to bring this to our governing board. And at this time, also invite members of the governing board for comments, starting with Lande.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I may have missed the process here, but I wanted to just make sure I could clarify how the ad hoc committee is selected each year and the logic behind having an ad hoc committee versus a standing committee, since this will be an ongoing responsibility of the board in an ongoing way. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to that.
That's a great question. And I think it's actually an area that we did not specify. So you didn't miss it. It's we didn't speak to how the governing board would select the ad hoc committee, just that it would occur. I don't know if that's something we would want to discuss right now.
Robert, I don't want to get in front of your meeting, so I have to let you make a decision as to whether or not you think that's worthy of discussion.
No problem at all. We actually have a set of slides that will cover a little bit of this in terms of impaneling the particular ad hoc committee, but I also wanted to sort of invite the ad hoc committee members for additional contextual thoughts on the question that Lande put forward. Chris.
Yes, thank you. In terms of the criteria for how to select the members of the committee, Elizabeth is correct. We didn't go into that, and I think it's something we assumed the board would discuss further before making those decisions. But in terms of Lande's other question about why a ad hoc committee versus a standing committee, my understanding is we tried to link this as much as possible to the governance manual that was approved by the board in the last meeting. And there is a provision for ad hoc committees to be created by the board, but I don't believe we have any standing committees in the governance manual to be created by the board. So that was the mechanism we linked it to.
I appreciate that response. I think my inclination would be for us to think about thinking about the ad hoc committee, maybe perhaps on a one-year basis, and then seeing if that makes sense going forward. I think there's some value in thinking about having some continuity over time in whoever is responsible for the performance review process. So if it's going to be a group of 5 people, you want to make sure that there are a couple of people who have been there in the previous year and that that's not being reconstituted every year. Just in terms of giving some support to the executive director, but also making sure that people are familiar with the process and also allow it to be as malleable as necessary over time. So I just want to make sure that we're building in a strong system that also has some elasticity and flexibility to it as we think about how best to support our executive leadership.
Great point. Sylvia.
So thank you for this really comprehensive work. Really appreciate the leadership that the ad hoc committee has brought to this issue. The question that I have is one that is really informed by my just curiosity. So I don't know that much about state government positions outside of my own state agency, but is this process that you're outlining, is it fairly comparable to how we review other individuals in this classification or at this level of leadership? Because I wouldn't want to create anything that is more onerous than what is probably already in place in state government. The second has to do with, was there any thought given to a more expansive review, say every 5 years, beyond just this annual review? Because I think an annual review will only get you so far, but it may be opportunity to do a deeper dive, say in a 5-year cycle. And again, I don't know if that's inconsistent with how state government job reviews occur, but I can tell you at the California State University, it's a pretty common practice to do more elaborate reviews in a periodic way to get to give everyone sort of time to do a deeper dive in how do we support the individuals in these key roles. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. I wanted to invite Kathy Booth, if she's here, to address the first point that Sylvia brought up, which is the question around the comparability of this process with other similar positions in the state. This was something that I know that the ad hoc committee discussed, but I'd like, if Kathy's available, to be able to speak to that question.
Happy to do so. We ran the draft policy by folks at the Government Operations Agency to make sure that we were in alignment with general policies, and we were told that what we had done was similar. We also made some edits to the specific review questions to align with some of the Cal HR approaches, especially sort of the inspirational leadership area. We may be doing a little bit more, and I would sort of actually defer to Elizabeth on this because it's a 360 review every single year. But the feeling was, to Sylvia's point, that there's really a desire to have really rich feedback, especially happening in the middle of a cycle for implementation of the work plan, to really set this up as an opportunity to ensure that the staff are best able to accomplish the visions set out by the governing board. Elizabeth, do you want to weigh in a little bit more about the HR policies that you were familiar with?
Sure. I think, Kathy, I appreciate your perspective here. I think that really covers the majority of it. But the one thing I wanted to call out that I know that we are different from, but I think is really critical, is that we're looking for feedback from so many stakeholders. The intent here is that the individuals who are providing feedback have expertise or experience or relevant work in the areas of the annual work plan, so that those specific reviewers would change year to year, but that they would be directly related to the intentions and intended outcomes of the executive director that year. So I think that is definitely a way that we're going kind of above and beyond the existing process. With regard to how in-depth the review process is, I think part of what our group really worked on was making sure that we retained the most important categories without having so many areas for review that it just, people kind of tuned it out, right? So knowing that we're asking our partners and stakeholders to participate in this process, we're looking for something that will ensure that they can fully engage and involve and fully participate while still hitting those most critical categories. So I think I can't really speak to whether this is more or less expansive than what would happen on an annual or a 5-year basis in the state, but I think we were going for a happy medium. I also wanted to just really speak to one other thing, if I could. I think that Londe had mentioned. Took me a minute to capture this. The ad hoc committee that's facilitating this process doesn't actually complete a review form. So they will be the coordinators and facilitators, but not the reviewers. So I think in terms of who is selected there, I love, I know I see in the chat, other folks also love the idea of having continuity across members across years, but it might reduce the qualifications required to participate in that ad hoc committee.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Any other members of the board would like to comment or raise a question? Chris.
Yes, thank you. I just want to second what Elizabeth was just saying about the role of the ad hoc committee. It's really the role of the board chair to evaluate the performance of the executive director, and this doesn't change that. The ad hoc committee's role is to facilitate the process. So the permanence of the board chair being the one filling out the performance review, conducting the performance review is still there. But I do think the idea of a standing committee is a good one that we should entertain and flesh out if others agree. And then also to Kathy's point, we had a very strong starting point in this process with materials from Cal HR. a leadership performance review form that we started with that was something we worked very hard to customize and contextualize and really make sure that we enshrine the values of the system and the priorities as expectations. And I just want to second the uniqueness of the 360-degree view of all the different stakeholders that are part of the system is something that we worked very hard to integrate into this. So I think, to some extent, it is, more in depth than what you might see in a typical performance review within the state HR system, but one that is necessary given the broad scope of stakeholders.
Thanks, Chris. Any other members of the board who'd like to speak? Seeing none, we'd like to move to public comment. Sydney, are there any public comments for this particular agenda item?
No, we have not received any public comment.
Let's give it a few seconds to ensure that those who would like to speak to this topic have the opportunity to do so.
Yes, if you are interested in making verbal public comment, please submit your request through the Q&A function that's located at the bottom of your screen. You can also submit written public comments through the Q&A function or at the email address listed on the slide. So we'll give you a couple moments to put in your request if you would like to be unmuted to share verbal public comments. And I do not see any public comments in the Q&A.
Thank you. So seeing none, I'd like to again thank the ad hoc committee for presenting this information. Elizabeth, Chris, Meredith, Gavin, Wesley, and Jerry. And I'd like to entertain a motion from a member of the board.
So moved, David.
David moves. Do we have a second?
Second.
Second comes from which speaker?
This is Chris Ferguelli from UCOP.
Thanks, Chris. Second from Chris Fergielli. Sydney?
Perfect. Okay, I will try to speed through these votes. Jerry Winkler.
Yes.
John Hetz.
Yes.
Sylvia Alva.
Yes.
Sylvia Alva, okay. Chris Ferguelli.
Yes.
Tom Vu.
Yes.
Debbie Cochran.
Yes.
Patrick Perry.
Yes.
David DeGear.
Yes.
Sorry, John Ohanian.
Yes.
Javier Romero.
Yes.
Catalina Cifuentes.
Yes.
Robert Tagorda.
Yes.
Landea Jose.
Yes, with reservations.
Okay. And once we finish the roll call vote, we'll come back so you can state your reservation for the record. Gavin Payne.
Yes.
Marisol Lavinia.
Yes.
Okay. Sujin Jez.
Yes.
Sean Elo Rivera.
Yes.
Meredith Lee.
Yes.
Dante Golden for Senator Laird.
Yes.
And Assembly Member Jackie Irwin.
Yes.
Okay, so it looks like it is mostly yes, and with one yes with reservations. Landea Jose, would you like to state your reservations for the record?
Sure, I was going to try and get in there with an amendment, but I didn't have it. I didn't jump on it quick enough, which was that we consider this as a one-year process to see how the an ad hoc piece would work. So I think, we've voted on it and it's fine, but I would likely, I'd like to have an opportunity to discuss again after we've gone through the first the first iteration of this process in a year to see how it's going before we launch into the second year of such an evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lonnie, for that remark and statement. And I think it's well within the spirit of our governing board and our approach to this particular year. So as we shift gears to actually putting the ad hoc committee in place, I'd like to invite members of the board to keep that spirit in mind, that we're going through this for the first time this year, and we want to make sure that we acquire the learnings and experiences to inform the following year's practices and so on down the line. So for this particular part of the agenda, it is the 2022-2023 Executive Director Review Ad Hoc Committee Charter, the 2022-23 Executive Director Review Ad Hoc Committee shall conduct the annual review for the Office of Cradle-to-Career Data for the Executive Director position. This will be a short-term ad hoc committee that will sunset after the 2022-23 Executive Director Review has been finalized by the Governing Board. Next slide, please. The commitments that are outlined are as follows. Meetings for this ad hoc committee will be exempted from Bagley-Keene regulations due to the sensitive nature of the content. In September, having just approved our annual work plan as well as the ad hoc committee process for reviews of the executive director, we'll use the annual work plan to create specific expected outcomes and identify at least 5 people to fill out the performance review form. Then in the subsequent month in October, ad hoc committee members will gather information to evaluate performance in line with what Elizabeth had presented to the board in the previous item. Next slide. Moving forward in the months of December, January, and February. December, the board chair-elect will review the performance review document. Thereafter, the ad hoc committee will meet with the executive director to share the performance review. And then in February, we'll share the report with the governing board during a closed session. So having outlined this commitment, obviously, I'd like to invite members of the board to consider participation in the ad hoc committee. You can email me by the end of the week. I'll gather the names and be able to put together an ad hoc committee that will proceed with the first review of our executive director. And if there are any questions at this time, I'd like to invite members of the board to either raise your questions or provide suggestions. Marisol?
Hi, Robert, I have a question. Will this committee have the ability to weigh in on the review form, or is this review form set? And I'm sorry if that was part of the previous conversation, and I was kind of slow on that part.
No problem. Let me invite members of the ad hoc committee, the previous ad hoc committee who put together the review process to answer that question.
So should I go ahead and speak? So
please.
So hi, Marisol. So I think what we have here is we have set the categories and subcategories for what the executive director would be reviewed on, but the intent is for the ad hoc committee that comes together, the executive director review ad hoc committee, to specify and refine those criteria so it really does align with their responsibilities and work plan for that given year.
Other questions from the board? looking at
there's
the,
I'm sorry, there's a
Go ahead.
question in the chat that says how many members from Sylvia?
thank you for that. How many members for the ad hoc committee? Was that envisioned in the work of the ad hoc committee that had put together the review process?
No, that wasn't something that we'd specified.
I do recall that we tried to do the math in terms of how many people would be facilitating the process and the chair and an incoming chair, and then how many board members would potentially be left to actually fill out the review questionnaire. But I don't recall, maybe Kathy has the document handy if we ended up specifying a range of actual numbers.
You didn't. You left that open. I think there was a feeling very much in line with Lande's comments that to be looking at it each year and figuring out what would be most appropriate. So I think that would be at the discretion of the board chair in the beginning to look for a reasonable group.
Thank you for that. I think one of the critical priorities for us is to ensure a diverse ad hoc committee, representative of each of the sectors that we have here on our governing board, as well as other issues concerning diversity of opinion, ideas, and representation. So those are certainly part of the consideration here, and would invite members of the governing board, if this is something of interest and the responsibilities associated with the ad hoc committee is one that aligns with your commitments, that you volunteer for the ad hoc committee by the end of the week. Any other questions before we proceed with the rest of our agenda? Chris.
Yes, thank you. Just a quick comment in response to Mary Saul's question about is there potential for further feedback on the performance review form itself. I think in terms of process, the ad hoc committee that developed the form that we see now that we just voted on is now sunsetted. And going forward, the ad hoc committee that's put together by the board to actually conduct the performance review would be the vehicle for entertaining any further additions or revisions to the performance review itself.
Thank you for that, Chris. Any others before we move to our next agenda item? Okay, thanks once again to the ad hoc committee members, and welcome those who want to volunteer for this particular committee. Now moving on to our next agenda item, task force report outs, teacher data and employment data. Mary Ann.
Thank you. So this item is an informational item for you. As you'll recall, in our last board meeting, we talked about establishing a number of task forces. So we wanted to give an opportunity to the task forces to report back on progress made, remaining open questions, so you can have an understanding of where the work is. So as a reminder, task forces are groups that we as an office convene when we want to get advice and input on specific implementation issues. So this summer in particular, we convened 2 task forces where we invited data experts, both from our data partners and from researchers, nationally recognized researchers, and here in California, to discuss key issues related to 2 things. Both of these are relevant for our planned teacher training and retention dashboard. So one task force focused on teacher training and retention data points, and the second task force zeroed in specifically on the data points relevant to employment and earnings for that. Next slide. So what comes next after these report outs? This input that we're getting from the task forces are going to inform our office's plans for how to build the data warehouse for analytical data and to shape efforts that will be done one-on-one with specific data providers to finalize which data elements to include in the data set. So in other words, we received input, we resolved some questions, and also identified some remaining open questions that our team can now work one-on-one with the different data providers on. So as we discussed in the timeline, this fall, we're going to start with the build of the data warehouse with the initial data submissions. And then we'll also be doing phase 1 of some user-centered design. And all of those processes can then refine the specific data definitions and decisions around calculations that were discussed in these task forces. So in a moment, we'll have report outs from those 2 task forces. As a reminder, in the last meeting, we also discussed a security policies task force that will be starting this fall. The charter for that was shared at the last meeting, and that document is still up on our governing board page if you would like to review it. But as a reminder, that task force will have the chief information security officers or equivalent from our data providers who will discuss in detail with our technical team the security policies that are in place. So that's big picture on the task forces. If we can advance to the next slide, I'd like to turn it over to the teacher data task force report out. I believe David will be doing this report out for us.
Yes, thank you, Marianne. So through the meetings this summer, we had excellent discussions about what exactly the data points were regarding the teacher training and credentialing. And which of our agencies have the most authoritative data. I think the report spells out really well the things that we were able to agree on, and then there's some additional things that we need to look at. And an important thing to note is that last paragraph is that as much as we're trying to have consistent data showing across all dashboards and across agencies, there will be some discrepancies, and we're going to try and have explanations for those when they occur. Are there any questions from board members?
Any questions from members of the board regarding this this summary? Chris.
Thank you. I have a question. I'm not sure if now is the right time to ask it, but I'll go ahead and ask. Is the P through 20 list of data elements that all data contributors have committed to, is that the primary vehicle that will be supplying data for this effort and for this dashboard? And if so, to the extent that data providers provide data through the P through 20, will they all be represented in this dashboard to the extent that their data links up with other agencies and surfaces information about teacher credentialing students and graduates and teachers?
So yes, the P20 list of data elements is what we worked off of. We clarified some of them, we added additional ones, and I believe that we will have to update data sharing agreements with agencies to cover those new elements. We will not have all participating agencies sending us data in this pilot. CSU will be the one sector of educator preparation who will definitely provide data. UC is looking into whether or not they can do it as well. So this is just, we have to remember that these are our trial dashboards, proof of concept. So not all of the data that we want to get in there will be there for the first set of dashboards.
But I guess my question is, if, per the work plan that we reviewed today, if data submissions of P through 20 data will be happening in the October to December timeframe, and if all data providers submitted data within that timeframe, wouldn't all of those data providers be reflected in this and not just the providers mentioned in this slide here?
We were really focused on the data definitions and the sources, so I'm not sure what the timeline is going to be for submitting data. I think we still have to finish contracting for the provider to put the data together. Mary Ann, can you talk more about that?
Yes, and so I think the way to think about the work of the task force is that they were defining as much as possible the data elements that would go into the dashboard. And we can work directly with you at UC and with additional data providers where there may be P20W data points that are relevant for the dashboard that were not explicitly discussed, and work through that together. So if you would welcome the opportunity to have some of those data elements that are relevant brought in, we can do that and can be in communication about at what stage that makes sense given the timeline of data submissions and the work on this. So thank you for raising that.
I see Ed Sullivan's hand raised as well. Ed?
And maybe just a minor amplification on what was already described. So Chris, the one thing that probably would be the grain, much like if you were asked to report on the minors of your students, credentials tend to be appended to other things and are not necessarily direct in the data that the CSU was going to provide directly. At the grain that is going to be required in order to do the dashboard. So there's a few things related to credential programs that were not envisioned in the original P20 sweep. So if you had just passed the P20 data set, you wouldn't have the elements that would allow to go all the way on this, short of that which would be intersecting against a CTC data set.
Thank you, Ed. Tom?
Yeah, thanks. Just a question then, considering that this dashboard will be built alongside what the CTC already currently has and all the information that the CTC currently has, is there, has it been considered that, the existing CTC data also be brought over for this proof of concept as well?
Yeah.
To reflect a bigger, broader look at teacher training and employment?
So yes, the Commission on Teacher Credentialing will be providing data for the dashboards. I'm not sure what you were asking about with the broader look. I think with these dashboards being proof of concept, we're not trying to cover everything initially, just trying to make sure that the data submission process works, that the data can all be put together, and then that we can provide dashboards that are meaningful to researchers, agencies, policymakers, and the public.
Okay, got it. Yeah, the intent behind my question was taking information, the CTC information that, or the teacher credentialing information that the UC already provides to you, or that the independent colleges and universities are already provide to you, that you have in the dashboard now, and then taking that information and putting it into this proof of concept. But it seems like the intent of this proof of concept is more to see if the data actually, actually transfers back and forth more beyond just, an example dashboard, I guess.
Yeah, you're exactly right there.
Thanks, Tom. Any other questions, comments from members of the board? Sujin.
Thank you. This will be, I think, a great dashboard and tool to launch. Question about the CDE data. Is it going to be focused on like the teachers with regards to employment, or will it also link to student data? Like, would you be able to understand, I don't know, teacher retention, placement, and looking at who their students are?
The initial dashboards will not be looking at any K-12 or TK-12 student data. It'll all be about teacher training and credentialing. And then over time, we'll be able to look at retention.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other members of the board? Questions or comments? Sylvia.
So my question is, when does this process begin? When do we start counting a data point? Is this once an individual is credentialed and in the classroom? Or does this go back to how many students have the major intent or aspiration of going into the profession? I'm trying to gauge how much data we're likely to have in terms of the population that this database intends to inform us around.
Sure. So initially, it will be starting with enrollment in a teacher preparation program at the college or university. Eventually, since we're going to have so much data about individuals, we'll be able to go back and look at high school information about candidates, so we can look at what types of high school students are enrolling in teacher prep programs and making it through to a credential.
Thank you. Will this allow us to count students in integrated teacher prep programs where they're blending together the undergraduate major and the credential experience?
I believe so. That is one piece of data that we started collecting, well, especially in relation to AB 130, which created new opportunities for candidates to demonstrate their subject matter competence. So we have started collecting that data, but I believe that CSU and UC are already, and the privates would also have that data.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from members of the board? Chris.
Yeah, just a quick question. You had mentioned the need to renegotiate or revise data sharing agreements with data providers. Are those individual agreements that would be created, or are we talking about the overall participation agreement that was signed by all data providers in the spring?
I believe it's the individual agreements that need to be updated to add additional data that the task force is recommending.
Yes, thank you for that. And there is specific language in the participation agreement that allows for this possibility of adding additional data points without needing to have the entire participation agreements renegotiated and re-signed. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. Other questions, comments? Seeing none, should we move to the next task force report out before public comment?
Yes.
David?
I was going to say, I think there was public comment on this task force.
So David, I believe we're planning to do public comment on both task forces in a moment once we've had the report out. So at this time, I'd like to invite Jill Lufkin to report out on the employment data task force.
Hi, thank you, Marianne. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Great. Well, I'm Jill Lufkin. I'm the Director of Workforce Policy and Data at the Success Center of the Foundation for California Community Colleges and a member of the Employment Data Task Force. As Marianne mentioned, this task force included state and national education and workforce experts who have experience working with employment and earnings data, as well as the representatives from the various segments that are providing the data. We used an evidence-based approach to develop recommendations on effective practices related to understanding and calculating employment and earnings data. To help us better understand the available employment and earnings data, EDD conducted some in-depth analyses on the state wage file that address basic questions about data variations and potential missing values. We use the findings of those analyses to inform our recommendations on the construction of variables that should be included in the query builder. This included how to operationalize cohorts of students, earnings gains, and living wage attainment. Because the query builder allows the user some flexibility in determining how to pull the data, we recommended a few different ways these variables can be constructed for that use. The group agreed that it is most beneficial to the average user if the dashboards have a single methodology for each of these constructs. So we identified considerations for the Cradle-to-Career team to keep in mind when determining how these should be operationalized for that purpose. We also provided feedback on issues to consider when testing data to ensure that the results are reasonable. Looking forward, the group suggested areas the Cradle-to-Career staff should investigate in order to strengthen the methodology for identifying which individuals are no longer in the labor market, further contextualizing earnings by looking at the industry of employment, and developing additional measures of economic mobility. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. Any questions, comments from members of the board? Wesley?
Thank you for the presentation. One question I had is, to what extent are we going to be able to capture people who are independent contractors or self-employed? I'm just trying to recognize that, that's a significant population as well, and not sure how much of that data does make it to EDD.
Yeah, I can speak to that. So self-employed persons are not included in the state wage file, but that is part of our recommendations about strengthening the methodology for finding individuals. There is some figures in the report out about the California Community College's career education programs collect some information about how many students self-report being self-employed. And so there are some figures about the numbers, the percent of those students who report being self-employed. If you are able to review that, it'll give you some sense of that. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think it was around 9% of those students or something like that.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments from members of the board? John?
Yes, I just was wondering whether or not there was any consideration or conversation about engaging in or setting up a process by which we would engage with the federal government and start to have conversations with the Internal Revenue Service. They've been a little bit more open to data sharing. There's a couple of national research projects using their data, and that would be something that might help address Wesley's question and give us far more insight to the employment outcomes of students, not only self-employed and other situations, but students who leave California.
I don't think we didn't talk specifically about recommending that, but we did leave the door open to continuing to investigate other means to which to contribute to more robust data, inclusive of finding students in other states or things like that.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from members of the board? Sujin.
I just wanted to emphasize John's comment. I think that this would be a priority for getting better data. Particularly, I feel like the large number of Californians who would not be included in the data here, and the focus I feel like on our higher ed institutions around entrepreneurship also. So just to lift that up as something that I think we should be trying to figure out more actively.
Thank you, Sujin. Debbie.
Thank you. I very much appreciate the discussion in the write-up, and I know it's obviously focused appropriately right now on things like principles of how we want to approach some of these questions. And I may have missed this. This may have been in the planning discussion earlier, but when would we expect to need to kind of make some very concrete decisions about calculations, and when would we begin to see some actual data pulled related to employment earnings from this data system?
So there are a number of dependencies in the annual work plan that we discussed. We need a couple of things to happen to build this dashboard. One is the actual review of the security policies and receiving data from our data providers. We also want to do the extensive user-centered design process to get input and also get input from our advisory boards. So I believe I have to go back to the documents that we are intending to move through that process through the end of this calendar year and hope to have a beta version of the dashboard early next year. That's an ambitious timeline, but that's kind of the vision right now, is that this would be built in tandem with the initial build of the data system. And also just responding to the prior comments, the data from EDD is what we have available right now. It's what we have available via our participation agreement. But the limitations of that and who shows up in the W-2 records that form that are known. And so I really appreciate the input. And I think it's also a helpful role that the board can play in lifting up the need for looking at additional data sources like that. So thank you for raising that.
Thank you. Any other members of the board would like to comment or ask questions about this topic? Seeing none, I'd like to move to public comment. Sydney, are there any public comments?
Yes, we have about 4 public comments, or 3 public comments, excuse me. So first up is Liz Guillen from Public Advocates. Regil, can you go ahead and unmute her, please? Liz, you can go ahead and unmute your line to share your public comment.
Oh, darn, I forgot to unmute.
There you are. We can hear you now.
Right. Sorry about that. Good afternoon, board members. Again, public advocates very much appreciate the hard work we've observed by the Teacher Data Task Force. And we want to thank all the participants who work with teacher data, many of whom we're privileged to partner with. I also thank the staff for the report out identifying for further analysis and documentation the question of whether teacher vacancies, assignments, and retention should be reported at the level of the school site versus the K-12 school district. Keeping in mind the overarching purpose of the teacher pipeline and retention dashboard to provide critical information to the public and policymakers to understand and actually address the shortage of teachers, as well as to show patterns of teacher diversity and mobility statewide, the very real and harmful experience of educational partners in hard-to-staff school sites, including students, parents, and communities, whose schools continually bear the brunt of shortages and teacher turnover, should be acknowledged and reflected in the decision about how this information is reporting. Reporting at the school site level, wherever possible, is critical. Otherwise, the improvement targets will focus merely on districts and not within districts at school sites. We concur with the staff's memo that the user-centered design process must include educational partners, specifically parents, students, and educators whose specific schools within an LEA continue to have the highest teacher turnover and vacancies. I also want to echo the request from other ed partners that the data set be expanded to include information to better understand training pipelines and retention for pre-K teachers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we have another request for public comment from Manny Rodriguez. Rachel, can you unmute Manny Rodriguez, please?
Good afternoon, everybody. Manny Rodriguez on behalf of the Institute for College Access and Success, TICAS. First, we'd like to thank the board, the Employment Task Force for the work they've done to parse through these data in order to construct employment earning metrics for dashboards and the query building tools. We look forward to future work and conversations on how you address some of the items elevated in the future considerations section. On behalf of TICAS, we'd like to express our agreement on the need to augment the UI data set with other sources such as FTB records, particularly those individuals not in the UI wage files, such as a subset of students in career education disciplines. We also agree with the idea of connecting C2C with the National Student Clearinghouse data to identify exiters as well as students who have graduated from colleges in other states and their highest degree awarded. Finally, we ask that when it comes to building cohorts within the query builder, we not only highlight the dimensions of highest level post-secondary education attained, but we also clarify what kind of institutions students attended, such as public 2- and 4-year institutions, private for-profits, private nonprofits, and out-of-state institutions. This connection between post-secondary education and the workforce is critical to understand students' employment earnings after college, debt to earnings ratio, and economic mobility. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll just do a last call for public comment. We do have one written comment. I will read it really quickly. From Raquel Morales from the Education Trust West. We appreciate the work of the Teacher Data Task Force members. We believe the C2C data system will provide stakeholders throughout the state with important information about the teacher workforce that will help inform decisions and help the state close equity gaps for California students. We want to uplift the recommendation that a wide range of stakeholders, including community members, educators, and advocates, be included in the user-centered design process to ensure the data will provide different stakeholders with the information they need. In addition, we also want to urge the inclusion of data regarding the pre-K and TK workforce. This data will be especially important given the recent investments in UPK and the tremendous need to hire educators to teach transitional kindergarten, as well as the upcoming launch of the P3 ECE credential. Other than that, we do not have any other public comment. So we will go ahead and close public comment. If you missed a chance, please feel free to still submit written public comment via Q&A or at the email listed on the slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Sydney, and thank you to members of the public for putting together your public comments. Before we turn it over to our last agenda item for today, I just want to thank again all of the members of our task force groups. There are 24 that were listed in the previous slides, and although it's too many to name at this particular juncture, wanted to express to them our gratitude for their service and commitment to this work. Marianne.
Thank you so much, Robert. We're almost at the end of our agenda. Otherwise, I would say let's take a break, but we just have one more informational item to get through. So I'm going to share this and wanted to thank all of you for engaging in a Zoom call feels longer than in person sometimes. So thank you for that. All right, one of the items that we talked about when we were going through the work plan is that we need to submit a legislative report on an annual basis. It's due in September. And so I'm going to share an outline of that in just a few minutes, and then we will share a draft with you. So the legislative report format summarizes some key year one accomplishments in governance, operations, community engagement, our California colleges.edu, progress to support college planning and transition, and then the technology infrastructure for the analytical data set. So this is the overall outline for the report. And then in each section, the way that we've structured this is to include a comparison about how our actual activities, now that we're in the implementation phase, how that compares to how each domain was envisioned in the planning process, and key implementation issues to keep in mind to keep fidelity to our intended work and our mission. So for this first report, we thought it would be helpful to frame it as, here's what was intended during the planning process, here's how that maps to the implementation, so that people can connect the dots across the two. And then we have a detailed appendix that lists the many responsibilities that are detailed in AB 132 and describes what the governing board is responsible for, the office, the data providers, and then maps to what we've already completed, what we've started, and what we're going to do in future years. So we have a detailed appendix that helps people navigate what we're required to do in our statute and how that matches with what we've done so far. Okay, a couple of report highlights of what we've achieved so far. Some of these we've already discussed under governance, seating the governing board, the advisory boards, developing the governance manual, the participation agreement, and as of today now, establishing, improving our work plan and budget request. On operations, establishing our office, including developing those core policies and the integration with the government operations agency, the selection of an executive director, establishing a staff leadership structure, and hiring an initial team that includes an initial executive team. We've talked about community engagement, the launch of the community conversations, providing interviews and presentations about the data system with the public, and our plans to ramp that up as we have more staff bandwidth as well. And then we have a section that describes the work that our partners at californiacolleges.edu are doing in partnership with many of our data providers to support college planning and transition. I've walked through a lot of these in my ED updates, so I won't read them out loud again. And the same for our milestones in technology infrastructure for the analytical data set, talking about completing stages 1, 2, and 3 already of the project approval lifecycle, selecting technology tools, and the work that is ongoing with the task forces and that we're continuing to work on documenting data definitions. So these are a couple of the highlights. In terms of next steps, as I mentioned, it's due in September, and so we will share a draft with you for review this month and welcome any input and insight that you'd like to share on that. Okay, I think that concludes the report out. I believe we are going to welcome public comment on this. Over to Sydney.
Yes, thank you. It looks like we have a public comment, and I actually did want to go back to another comment that we received during the previous public comment period. My apologies for missing this. This person asked to have it read on her behalf. It's from Molly Esquivel. She asked, will this concept of data collection be shared with students? What types of transparency measures are you taking with students and teachers? What opt-out options are available for those that wish to protect their privacy? There's a rise in those that wish to protect their privacy and want to opt out of data collection and surveillance. So I did want to read that comment specifically because she asked. It looks like one of our board members responded with a link to the planning website that talks about those issues in depth. The next public comment we have was submitted for written public comment. I'll just read it really quickly. And while I'm reading for the public members, if you have other public comments, please use the Q&A function to either submit written comments or to ask to be unmuted for verbal comments. So this is from Chantal Lamarelle. She said, I would like to challenge and encourage this group to expand the verbiage to include data points, demographics for funding sources, ED and data, workforce development in the state in regards to the early care and education positions like pre-TK within the career. For example, children museum professionals, child life specialists, and child development college professors at community colleges and university salaries to be included in the data sources. Thank you. That is the only public comment that we have. So I'll just do another last call for public comment. And again, if you don't get your public comment submitted in time, please feel free to send them to the email address listed on the slide. Okay, we have one more from Anna Alvarado on behalf of the California Edge Coalition. We thank the Employment Task Force for their thoughtful discussions around employment and earning metrics. As the board continues to identify additional measures of economic mobility, we ask that opportunity youth are part of the conversations, the 16 to 24-year-old population who are disconnected from the education and workforce systems, including foster youth, justice-involved immigrant youth. This population needs to be elevated in the data system to re-engage them in career readiness and employment opportunities. Thank you. And I do not see any other public comment, so we'll go ahead and close public comment at this time.
Thank you for that, Sydney. I also want to acknowledge a comment left in the chat from Governing Board Member Soo Jin. I also think about students at for-profit institutions. I imagine many of those students, graduates, are self-employed, like cosmetologists, truck drivers, etc. Understanding their outcomes should be a state priority too. Thank you for that comment, Soo Jin. At this time, we've reached the end of our agenda. Our next meeting is on November 2, 2022, from 9:30 to 5 p.m. I'd like to entertain, actually see Patrick Perry with your hand raised. Patrick.
Hi there, thanks. Going back to something Manny was talking about. So Marianne, is it explicit in our work plan yet that we will be doing a master data match with the National Student Clearinghouse? Have we spec'd that out yet?
I will double check. That's definitely in the planning documents. Let me double check if we put that in a level of detail in the work plan. You need to go back and.
Okay. I mean, obviously it'd be useful for a wide variety of reporting purposes. The reason why I bring it up at this point is because it's a pricey thing, but I think we're going to have to do it, and pretty much everyone already does it. It's probably going to be a 6-figure budget item, given the last time CDE attempted to do this for a one-off match. And you're going to want to put that cost into a BCP probably pretty soon, so that that placeholder is there to cover that. But it's probably going to be a six-digit number, and we probably want to spec out what that's going to be.
Thank you for elevating that. That's definitely been on our list, and I appreciate you elevating that.
Okay.
Keep that in mind for the BCP.
Thank you, Patrick and Marianne, and thanks to all of the board members for your engagement during today's proceedings. At this time, I'd like to entertain a motion to adjourn, as well as a second.
This is Kevin, so moved.
I'll second.
Okay, I won't put you guys through roll call again. I'm assuming we'll go ahead and vote. Just unmute and say aye if you vote yes. And I'll take the vote like that.
Aye.
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 Okay, I think I saw everybody unmute, so we're gonna go ahead and say the ayes have it. Do we have any no votes? I'm assuming we don't. Okay, perfect. The ayes have it. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Sydney. Thanks to everyone.